My wife's boss blamed her for a death he caused. It started with the smell of smoke. Not the cozy, wood-burning kind, but something acrid and chemical, the scent of plastic melting. My wife, Sarah, an ICU nurse with 17 years of experience under her belt, had come home from her shift an hour earlier. She was usually meticulous, placing her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, lining her shoes up perfectly in the closet. But tonight she'd stumbled in, reeking of cheap whiskey, and made a beeline for the back garden without a word. I found her sitting on the cold flagstones, the orange glow of a small, angry fire illuminating her face. Tears were carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks as she fed the flames with the pieces of her life. Her nursing scrubs, the ones she wore like a second skin, were already a blackened, bubbling mess. Beside them, she was dropping in her nursing school mementos, photos, certificates, things she once told me were worth more than gold. She was violently, silently sobbing. I didn't rush her. I just sat down on the ground a few feet away, the heat of the fire a strange comfort in the cold night air. I waited. For almost 2 hours, I just held her, my hand rubbing slow circles on her back as the fire died down to embers, until the words finally started to spill out, fractured and raw. The story she told me wasn't just about a bad shift. It was about a moment that had shattered the very foundation of who she was. The night before, at 4 in the morning, the dead hour, as they call it, the ICU had exploded. Not with a sound, but with the silent, screaming alarms of failing bodies. 3 of her patients started coding at once. 3 red alerts, 3 lives hanging by a thread in 3 separate rooms. She was the only nurse on that section of the floor. She'd immediately sprinted to the administrator's office. A man whose name I won't use, but a man we'll call Mr. Cheeseburger Gut, because that's the most generous description I can muster. She found him with his feet up on his desk, scrolling through his phone. She begged him, her voice cracking with urgency, to get 2 more nurses to help her. But our hospital, in its infinite wisdom and pursuit of profits, was run on a shoestring budget. The other nurses were on opposite wings of the building, and they'd never been given communication devices. Getting them would mean the administrator himself would have to physically run and track them down. He didn't even take his feet off the desk. "You've handled worse, Sarah," he'd said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "You're my best nurse. That's why I put you on the tough cases." My wife, a woman who had calmly faced down death more times than I could count, pleaded with him. She told him she physically couldn't be in 3 places at once, that people were going to die. His response, delivered with all the empathy of a block of concrete, was, "We all need things. Make it work." So she ran back to the ICU, her heart pounding against her ribs, faced with an impossible, monstrous choice. Who do you save first? The young mother in room 4, bleeding internally after a car crash? The teenager in room 7 with meningitis, his body convulsing in a violent seizure? Or the patient in room 12, her best friend Lisa's mother? Lisa and Sarah had grown up together, 2 houses down from each other, since they were 5. Lisa's mom was like a second mother to Sarah, the one who'd taught her how to bake, who'd held her after her first real breakup. She was in for pneumonia, but she was supposed to have another 2 or 3 weeks left, a little more time to say goodbye. Sarah made her choice. She ran to the teenager first, the most immediate and violent crisis. She managed to get him stabilized, shoving medication into his forcing a tube down his throat. Then she sprinted to the young mother. The internal bleeding was severe, her blood pressure plummeting. Sarah worked frantically, a whirlwind of skill and adrenaline, and managed to control it, packing the wound, screaming for a surgeon. She'd saved 2, but then it happened. By the time she made it to room 12, the alarms were a continuous, soul-shattering scream. Lisa's mother was barely conscious, her breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Sarah started compressions immediately, throwing her entire body weight into the effort, but she knew. She could feel it in the way the ribs didn't respond, in the lifelessness under her hands. It was too late. Protocol says you stop after a certain point, but Sarah kept going for 30 minutes. 30 minutes of pounding on the chest of the woman who was like a mother to her, even though she knew after 5 that it was hopeless. She finally called the time of death at 4:47 a.m. The worst part, the part that made my own stomach clench with rage, as she told me, wasn't even over. Before she could even process what had happened, before the room was even cleaned, 2 new critical patients were wheeled in. She passed Lisa's mother's body, shrouded in a white sheet on a gurney, being wheeled to the morgue. And she had to keep working. At 5 a.m., the administrator did his little stroll through the ICU. He saw Sarah, her face pale and drawn, her scrub stained with sweat and God knows what else. He actually had the audacity to nod approvingly. "See," he said with a smug little smile. "I knew you could handle it." Sarah stumbled into a supply closet and threw up until there was nothing left. Then she went back to her other patients. And still it got worse. At the 7 a.m. shift meeting, In front of all her colleagues, the administrator used Lisa's mother's death as a teaching moment. He stood at the front of the room, puffed up with self-importance, and said, "We lost a patient in room 7 last night." He couldn't even get the room number right. This is what happens when nurses don't prioritize properly. You need better time management skills. Sarah just broke. She started crying right there, the kind of racking sobs that come from a place of utter devastation. The administrator's response was to point at her. And this, he said to the room, this emotional response is exactly the problem. This kind of behavior affects team morale. Document everything properly and see me after your shift. He wrote Sarah up. The official charge was emotional unprofessionalism. After she finally got the whole story out, she passed out on the couch, a mess of alcohol and grief. And that's when my day of planning began. I'm a former military medic. I've been in situations where you have to make life and death decisions in a split second. I know what that weight feels like. And for some lazy, cheeseburger-gutted excuse for a human being to put my wife through that, to make her feel that way, and then to publicly humiliate her for it, I wasn't going to let that slide. I waited until midnight, then I drove to the hospital. I parked my truck directly in the administrator's reserved spot, the one with his name on a stupid little plaque. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the darkness, a cold, patient anger settling in my bones, and I waited. He showed up at 6 a.m., right on schedule. He was furious about his parking spot, his face turning a blotchy red as he got out of his luxury sedan. But when he stepped out, I stepped out too. I walked right up to him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and even. "About what you did to my wife." Honestly, a part of me, the part that still lives in the dust and chaos of a war zone, wanted to do things that would get me 25 to life. But I restrained myself. Instead, I laid it out for him. I told Mr. Cheeseburger Gut that the patient who died wasn't just a number on a chart. She was Sarah's best friend's mother. I told him he had forced my wife, his best nurse, to choose who lived and who died because he was too lazy to get off his ass and find help. He wasn't interested. He tried to brush past me, muttering something about security. But sadly for him, I stood firm. I'm not a small guy. That's when he played his card. He threatened to call security and report my wife for patient abandonment. Abandonment? He sneered. That old woman was dying anyway. This is part of the job. I clenched my fist so hard my knuckles went white. "Say that again," I said. And the idiot did. "Okay," he said, his arrogance making him stupid. She was going to die anyway. Me going around chasing a nurse who was God knows where wasn't worth it. That's when I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I'd hit record the moment I stepped out of my truck. "I've been recording you the whole time," I said. His face went white as a sheet. For a second, he looked like a panicked fish, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Then, the panic turned to a calculating rage. He lunged for my phone, his gold wedding ring catching on the fabric of my jacket and tearing it. The sound of ripping cloth mixed with his heavy, wheezing breaths as we struggled in the empty parking lot. "Your wife killed that woman through negligence," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I'll make sure everyone knows it." Just then, 2 security guards rushed out from the hospital entrance. They separated us before things could escalate any further. One of the guards, a younger guy I recognized from the night shift, was crying, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He'd been on duty when Lisa's mother had died. The administrator immediately started spinning his version of the story, pointing a trembling finger at me, claiming I'd threatened him. Within minutes, we were being marched to his office. HR was already there, a woman named Catherine who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Sarah's personnel file was open on the desk. My stomach dropped when I saw the dates on the papers inside. He'd been documenting fabricated concerns about Sarah for months, building a paper trail, preparing for something exactly like this. They made me wait outside while he went in first. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I played back the recording. The wind whipping through the parking lot had distorted the audio. It was fuzzy, almost useless. I could just make out the words, "dying anyway," but the rest of his confession was garbled. Damn it. I went to the cafeteria to buy some time and think. And that's when I saw her. Lisa. She was at the coffee machine, wearing one of her mother's old, oversized cardigans. She still had her hospital visitor badge clipped to the collar from the night before. My chest tightened. "Oh, thank God you're here," she said, her eyes red and puffy. I wanted to thank Sarah personally, but they said she called in sick. She tried so hard to save Mom. The other nurses told me she did CPR for 30 minutes. I stood there, frozen, the words caught in my throat. I couldn't tell her the truth, not then. She hugged me, and I could smell her mother's familiar perfume on the cardigan. It felt like a punch to the gut. I mumbled something about Sarah needing rest and escaped as quickly as I could. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah, her voice confused and groggy from the alcohol. "Where are you?" she asked. "I had the strangest dream about telling you something about Lisa's mom." She didn't remember. The trauma and the booze had blacked it out. Before I could even decide what to say, I heard her gasp on the other end of the line. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God." It wasn't a dream. Lisa's mother. I couldn't save her. I heard her running to the bathroom, the sound of her retching echoing through the phone. I started the car to head home, but the administrator appeared at my window, knocking sharply with his class ring. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. He held up a piece of paper. Termination papers. Delete the recording, he said. Delete it now, and Sarah keeps her job. I'll even write her a glowing recommendation. She'll never have to know about this conversation. I stared at the papers. Sarah's name was typed at the top. Reason for termination: patient abandonment, resulting in death. You have 10 seconds to decide, he said. I put the car in drive and pulled away without a word, leaving him standing there. At a gas station a few blocks away, a car pulled up next to me. A nurse got out, someone I'd seen around the hospital but never met. She glanced around nervously before approaching my window. I was in the staff meeting, she whispered, her voice trembling. When he blamed the wrong room number, I recorded it on my phone. We all do it for meeting notes. I have his whole speech about room 7, when the patient who died was in room 12. She showed me the video on her phone. It was crystal clear. The administrator's voice was distinct, his lie perfectly captured. But she was terrified. I have 2 kids, she said. I can't lose this job. But what he did to Sarah, she transferred the file to my phone and drove away before I could properly thank her. When I got home, Sarah was in the backyard again, poking at the ashes of her burned scrubs. A small piece of fabric had survived the fire. The number 12 was partially visible on the melted name badge. She picked it up and started sobbing again. An hour later, I convinced her to lie down and drove to Lisa's house to pay my respects. The administrator's car was parked in the driveway. Through the window, I could see him handing Lisa an envelope. When I knocked, Lisa answered, tears streaming down her face. The hospital sent a representative, she said, gesturing to the administrator. They brought a $5,000 bereavement fund check. Isn't that thoughtful? The administrator smiled at me over Lisa's shoulder, a sickeningly smug look on his face. We take care of our families here, he said, though some nurses handle these situations better than others. I was just explaining to Lisa how these critical moments require split-second decisions. Some nurses make the right choices. Others will. Lisa's face clouded with confusion. He was planting the seeds of doubt, turning Lisa's grief into a weapon against Sarah. I left before I did something I would regret. The next day, things started to unravel with terrifying speed. Sarah's prescription for antidepressants was denied at the pharmacy. The reason? An employment verification issue. Without insurance, the medication would cost $400. That night, I sat in my home office, reviewing the 2 recordings. The administrator had clearly said room 7 in the meeting. Lisa's mother was in room 12. His mistake was deliberate, designed to confuse the narrative and shift blame. The following morning, I met with the hospital's night janitor at a local diner. He'd reached out through the nurse who had given me the first video. He was terrified, but he needed to talk. He told me he'd seen the administrator in the ICU at 3:45 a.m., right before the crisis started, looking at the patient boards. It was strange, the janitor said, his English heavily accented. Administrators never come that early. He knows I'm undocumented. My whole family depends on this job. Before he could say more, my phone rang. It was Sarah, crying hysterically. She was in her car, on her way to the hospital. I need to get my things, she sobbed. I need to talk to him. I threw some money on the table and ran. I found her in the employee parking lot, still wearing yesterday's clothes. She was clutching printed-out emails between her and Lisa's mother, making lunch plans for the following week. I chose wrong, she kept saying over and over. I should have saved her first. She trusted me. She broke down completely, her body shaking so violently I was afraid she was having a stroke. I drove her to an urgent care clinic, where she collapsed from dehydration and pure exhaustion. That evening, Lisa showed up at our house. The administrator had given her mother's full medical chart. Full transparency. The chart showed in stark clinical black and white that Sarah had entered room 12 last. Your wife chose to let my mother die. Lisa screamed at me, her voice raw with pain and anger. She saved strangers instead of the woman who helped raise her. The confrontation spilled out into our front yard. Neighbors came out onto their porches, some recording on their phones as Lisa shouted that Sarah had let her mother die. I realized then that the administrator had orchestrated all of it. He was turning our lives into a public spectacle. The next day, Lisa filed a formal complaint with the police department, alleging negligence. The desk sergeant told me the administrator had already called to report an incident pattern with Sarah. Our attorney delivered the bad news in his stuffy office. We lived in a 2-party consent state. The recording I'd made in the parking lot was illegal. If I used it, I could be arrested for wiretapping. The administrator was untouchable. Meanwhile, his assault continued. A colleague of Sarah's texted her a photo from that morning staff meeting. The administrator had announced Sarah's indefinite suspension, and on the meeting room whiteboard, in bright red marker, were the words, Sarah, unstable. Then came the social media post. Lisa uploaded a photo of her mother with a caption, "Killed by negligent nurse Sarah, last name, who chose to save others first." Within hours, it had nearly 1,000 shares. The comments were a cesspool of death threats and vitriol. Former colleagues sent Sarah messages, formally distancing themselves. The final blows came in quick succession. Our bank froze our joint account, citing a concerned call about my threatening behavior at the hospital. Bills started bouncing. Sarah's pastor, a man who had known her since she was a child, canceled their counseling appointment. The administrator served on the church board. Even our spiritual support was cut off. I went out to get groceries and found our car tires slashed. Our home security camera showed a teenager in a memorial t-shirt with Lisa's mother's picture on it. The administrator had weaponized an entire community against us. Sarah's health insurance was terminated, effective immediately. The pharmacist at CVS slipped me a note with Sarah's $400 medication. "He was in here yesterday," it read, asking about all her prescriptions. He was digging for anything he could use. Then, the termination letter arrived. The document was dated 3 days before Lisa's mother had even died. He had pre-planned the whole thing. He'd set Sarah up to fail from the very beginning. That was the moment something in her broke and then reformed into something harder. This wasn't just about a tragedy anymore. This was a calculated, systematic destruction of a human being. The police arrived the next morning with a restraining order. We couldn't go within 500 feet of the hospital. Then the anonymous death threats started showing up in our mailbox. We checked into a motel when Rox came through our living room window. Even there, he found us. The desk clerk mentioned someone had called, asking if we'd registered. It was another nurse who finally gave us a lifeline. A different night nurse, one who had been working on the opposite wing during the crisis. She met me at a desolate truck stop diner, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. She'd been in the administrator's office when Sarah had begged for help. She had stayed behind, hidden after Sarah ran out. And she'd heard him on the phone with someone, presumably a superior. She'd heard him say, clear as day, "Let the old woman go. She's costing us too much anyway." And she had recorded it. The audio was damning. But she had a work visa, 2 kids. The administrator controlled her entire future. She transferred the file to my phone and left. With this new evidence, the district attorney's office finally agreed to review the case. The administrator's words suggested a decision that had directly caused a death. It was complex, but it was something. The administrator's lawyer arrived at our motel with a settlement offer. Sign an NDA, accept a modest payout, and leave town forever. Sarah looked at the papers with dead eyes. The man who had destroyed her was now offering to pay for her silence. But then, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The janitor, the quiet hero of this whole nightmare, met me again. He'd found something in the trash from the administrator's office, a staffing chart from the night of the crisis. 3 nurses had been scheduled for the ICU. The administrator had personally crossed 2 names out, reassigning them to save on overtime costs. He hadn't just failed to help. He had intentionally created the deadly situation. Armed with this, our attorney went on the offensive. And then, the most unexpected ally of all appeared. The administrator's own son, a college kid home for the weekend, showed up at our motel. He was visibly distressed. He'd overheard his father at dinner weeks before the incident, complaining about the old woman in room 12 and her expensive, prolonged care. His conscience wouldn't let him stay silent. His willingness to testify changed everything. The prosecutor moved forward with charges of negligent homicide. The hospital board distanced themselves. The narrative finally started to shift. The administrator wasn't finished, though. He launched a new social media campaign, spreading rumors about Sarah's past. A photo of her burning her scrubs, taken by someone who had been watching our house that night, surfaced online. But his desperation was showing. The night nurse, after he threatened her children's school enrollment, finally agreed to testify. Her courage inspired the janitor to come forward with a staffing chart. A cascade of witnesses, finally freed from their fear, emerged from the shadows. The preliminary hearing was a turning point. The prosecutor played the night nurse's recording. The administrator's voice filled the courtroom. "Let the old woman go. She's costing us too much anyway." Lisa was sitting in the gallery. I watched her face crumble as she finally understood the truth. Her mother hadn't died because Sarah chose wrong. She died because the administrator chose profits. He accepted a plea deal, 18 months for criminally negligent homicide. It wasn't enough for a life, but it was something. Before we left town for good, Sarah met with Lisa in the hospital's memorial garden. They cried together, 2 women victimized by the same broken system. We moved 2 hours away to a town where no one knew our names. Sarah took a position at a new hospital, one with proper staffing ratios and a supportive administration. The administrator served 12 months of his 18-month sentence. Good behavior. Overcrowding. The system that had briefly held him accountable spat him back out. We thought it was over. But then a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a single photo of Sarah entering her new hospital, taken from across the street. He knew where we were. The harassment started again, subtle at first. An anonymous email to her new supervisor, detailing the old incident. Lisa, in a moment of drunken grief, called the new hospital, rambling about her mother's death. Rumors started to spread through the new nursing staff. A neighbor saw a man, matching his description, taking photos of her new house. He was surveilling us. Sarah was placed on probationary status. And then came the breaking point. A subpoena. He was suing us for defamation, claiming our false accusations had destroyed his career. He was using the legal system as his new weapon, trying to bankrupt us, to bleed us dry until we had nothing left. The night nurse, God bless her, came through one last time. She met me at a rest stop halfway between our cities. She was terrified of being deposed, of him discovering where she now worked. She handed me a flash drive. It contained every secret recording she'd made during her employment at the old hospital. Years of them. Dozens of meetings where the administrator was captured discussing patients as financial liabilities, talking about clearing beds and managing losses. Sarah's case wasn't an isolated incident. It was his standard operating procedure. Our attorney's eyes widened as he reviewed the files. The defamation suit would open the administrator up to discovery. His entire predatory history would become public record. We countersued for malicious prosecution, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. His lawyers, seeing the mountain of evidence against them, tried to get him to drop the suit. He refused. His ego wouldn't allow it. But his own tactics began to backfire. His constant medical delays for the deposition, claiming chest pains, led a judge to order an independent medical examination. He was perfectly healthy. His consulting firm, the one he'd started after getting out of prison, was struggling. No one wanted to hire a man convicted of negligent homicide. He was destroying himself. 2 days before his deposition, news broke. He'd been arrested in another state for falsifying credentials to get another hospital administration job. His prohibition from healthcare was permanent, and he'd violated it. Facing new fraud charges, his house of cards finally collapsed. He pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence. This time, he got 2 years in state prison with no possibility of early release. As they led him away in handcuffs, he just looked small. With him gone for good, the world started to feel safe again. Sarah's probationary status was lifted. The other nurses, who had kept their distance, finally embraced her as one of their own. We learned to live without constantly looking over our shoulders. The hypervigilance faded. One night, about a year later, Sarah worked a code blue that mirrored that terrible night. 3 patients crashing at once. But this time, she had support. 2 other nurses responded instantly. They worked as a seamless team. All 3 patients survived. She called me from the break room afterwards, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She had proven it to herself, finally. It was never her failure. It was his. She had been tested by a man who saw human lives as numbers on a spreadsheet, and she had survived. We had survived. The scars were there. They would always be there, but we were whole.